Before moving on, I want to dive deeper into a number of personal recollections that were recorded in the years after the events. And if you've noticed any differences in the account that I just shared of the Battle of San Jacinto, it's because there are lots of different accounts that were given afterwards. Some of them were more favorable to Houston, some were not favorable at all to Houston. And that's because, in large part, that Texas politics became an issue of personality after the Republic was founded. And the formation of the story of Texas history was in its infancy then. The birth of the myth and mystique of Texas started then into shaping it into what we have had for several decades now. And I did my best to try to go through as many different accounts, textbooks, books about San Jacinto, references of all kinds of different sorts, to try to see what was the most common account that made sense with each other. And in the future, I'm going to be digging through deeper and deeper into more personal accounts and different accounts of the Battle of San Jacinto and refining this to something a little bit more comprehensive and complete. And so before moving on, I want to focus more on some actual firsthand accounts that have been saved and recorded over the years. And they're quite fascinating. They don't all agree with each other, but where they do, you can build a basis for which there's some consistency in the narrative and what happened. Depending on where you were on the battlefield, you couldn't see everything that was happening. So it's interesting to see the accounts of people from different places in the battle. And so let's begin with James Monroe Hill. Now, Hill was one of Burleson's men, and he provides quite a bit of detail. So in the quote from him, he starts, "At about 3:00 in the afternoon of the 21st, the order was given to fall in line. We were going to fight now. The order was hardly given sooner than obeyed, for we kept ready all the time. We had nothing else to do, and we did that with a will. Each company took its place in the line, and we marched through the north end of the island of timber. Houston passed by me riding a gray dapple horse, his big saber swinging by the buckskin strings to his belt. And I thought him the finest looking man I had ever seen, or ever yet have seen. I thought it probable that either he or his horse would be shot. A noted mark for the enemy, had all confidence in his bravery." And then later, Hill added, "As I passed down the flatlands, I saw General Houston on a different horse. I afterward heard that it was a third one, two having been killed under him. I did not know then that he himself was wounded." Lyman Frank Rounds, a member of the Army of San Jacinto, also later wrote his thoughts of the attack. And he said, "We lay here until about 4:00 p.m., 21st of April, when we formed to make the attack. Now, although an admirer of General Houston, I think he made a rather unmilitary movement in making the attack. We formed in double file, marched at a right angle on the enemy's left until within musket range, filed to right by flank, so that our Company A had to march the entire length of the Mexican line under fire before we could face to the front and return their fire. But nevertheless, in 20 minutes, we had them on the run, and before sundown, we stretched 800 of them on the field, never to rise again on the 22nd. And that corresponds with an earlier account of somebody saying how they had marched out and then marched across the field. And so instead of apparently marching straight across, they actually tried to stay under cover as long as possible and then crossed across the field and spread out the line. Moses Austin Bryan, who was related to Stephen F. Austin, wrote of Houston's wounding. He wrote, "Soon after the general ordered Captain Turner's men back to the Mexican camp and is about to return himself, being shot through the ankle, when a Mexican officer's horse, upon which he had been mounted after losing the gray upon which he went into battle, fell with the general and expired in a few minutes. Some men standing by catching the general as he fell. I, with others, looked at the horse and found he was shot through with a ball. The general mounted again and left for the Mexican camp, which was the last I saw of him that evening. James Washington Winters, who is also part of Sherman's group, described the action. I saw Houston in the midst of the enemy's tents near the 1st Regiment to the right. A Mexican officer tried to rally his men, but was soon dispatched by a rifle ball and fell from his horse. Our regiment passed beyond the Mexican breastwork before we knew it, while our other 2 regiments came up in front of them. So then we did them up in short order. I never heard any halt order. We never halted. The battle was won in 15 or 18 minutes. The Mexican cavalry broke in disorder, while ours was hotly pursuing them. Houston had 2 horses killed from under him and was on his 3rd one before we passed the Mexican works. Alfonso Steele described his part of the combat. We advanced in the following order: Houston with artillery in the center, the cavalry on the right, and Sherman on the left. The Mexicans had thrown up breastworks out of their baggage about 100 yards south of a point of timber where they had stationed their artillery. Santa Anna's right wing was placed in a thick grove of timber. When we got pretty close, General Houston sent word to Colonel Sherman to attack this position. We were ordered to move forward and hold our fire until orders were given. When we got up within 60 or 70 yards, we were ordered to fire. Then all discipline, so far as Sherman's regiment was concerned, was at an end. We were all firing as rapidly as we could, and as soon as we fired, every man went to reloading. And he who first got his gun reloaded moved on, not waiting for orders. I got my gun loaded and rushed on into the timber and fired again. When the second volley was poured into them in that timber, they broke and ran. As soon as I got my gun loaded again, I ran on a little in front of our men and threw up my gun to shoot when I was shot down. Dave Rusk was standing by me when I was shot. He told some of the men to stay with me, but I told him, no, take them on. One of our men in passing asked me if he could take my pistol, but by this time I was bleeding at the nose and mouth, so I couldn't speak. So he just stooped down and got it and went on. After laying there a while, I managed to get to a sitting position and drink some water I had in a gourd. This stopped the blood from coming from my nose and mouth. While I was sitting thus, one of our men who had been lying behind came along and asked me if I was wounded. I told him I was, and he said, I will stay with you then. I told him, all right, please go and bring me a gourd of water. While he was gone after the water, I got up to see if I could walk. I had lost so much blood. When I had walked 5 or 6 steps, I got blind and couldn't see. I sat down by a little sapling. After sitting there a few minutes, I could see again. About this time, the fellow got back with a gourd of water. Just as he went to hand me the water, a couple of Mexicans came running towards us. I suppose they had hid in the grass until our men had passed and were now running back to get out of the way. When they got in about 20 steps of us, they saw us and threw up their hands and began to jabber something. I said to the fellow with me, shoot one of them Mexicans. He said, I can't do it. They want to surrender. I said, I don't want any more prisoners. Hand me my gun and I will shot one of them. He handed me my gun, which was lying where I had fallen, and I shot one of them down. The other ran off. The fellow said, it won't do for us to stay here in this timber. I said, well, you can go. I can't. I will go and get you a horse and carry you out, he said. He went and got a horse and carried me out and put me among a lot of dead Mexicans. I was so blind I could hardly see anything, and I sat down on a dead Mexican. While I was sitting there, some of our regulars who had stayed at the Mexican breastworks and were sticking their bayonets through the wounded Mexicans came along, and one of them had his bayonet drawn to stick through me, when General Tom Green, who belonged to the artillery corps, stopped him. Then I was put on a horse and started toward our camp. No one went with me, but the horse carried me in all right. That night I was carried across the bayou to De Zavala's residence, which he had given up as a hospital. Another early recorder of the events that's anonymous, unfortunately. I haven't been able to figure out who it was that wrote it, but it's in the official records. He wrote, volunteers armed with muskets and bayonets and the residue were armed with rifles and belt pistols. The Mexicans were encamped on a high prairie, with their right resting in a cedar thicket upon the border of a lake connected with the San Jacinto River. The division of coast was about 150 yards in the rear of their front line, resting in careless security after their forced march. Benjamin McCullough recalled the events as follows. At the Battle of San Jacinto, I was in command of one piece of artillery. The fire from it opened upon the enemy about 200 yards distant. We advanced after each discharge, keeping in advance of the infantry until we were within less than 100 yards of their breastwork, at which time I had aimed the gun, but was delayed in firing for a moment by General Houston, who passed across some 30 yards in front of the gun, and was at that time nearly that distance in advance of every man in that part of the field. After this, I saw him advancing upon the enemy, at least 1/3 of the distance between the two armies, in front of Colonel Burleson's regiment, when it was not more than 70 or 80 yards from the enemy's breastworks. About this time, the enemy gave way and the rout became general. Walter Lane, who had been injured the previous day, participated in the combat and had this memory. General Houston wanted to wait a few days for reinforcements. He told them that he had couriers from several companies all hurrying on that would be there in 2 days. He was right, but the men sent up their officers demanding fight. So fight it was. We marched out about 4 o'clock in the afternoon to attack the enemy, to the tune by drum and fife of the girl I left behind me. You see, there's a difference in what song it was. When we got in half a mile of them, the artillery and infantry opened on us. But as we were going up a slight ascent, they overshot us. We never fired a gun until we got within 40 yards. The order rang out, halt, fire, and charge. We did. In a second, we were into them with guns, pistols, and bowie knives, and there arose the cry of "Remember the Alamo." In a short time, they were running like turkeys, whipped and discomfited. As we charged into them, the general commanding the Tampico battalion, their best troops, tried to rally his men, but could not. He drew himself up, faced us, and had said in Spanish, "I have been in 40 battles and never showed my back. I am too old to do it now." General Rusk hallooed to his men, "Don't shoot him," and knocked up some of their guns, but others ran around and riddled him with balls. I was sorry for him. He was an old Castilian gentleman, General Castrillo, meaning General Castrillon. As we charged through their camp, I heard a row in a hospital tent. It was a countryman of mine. A wounded officer was lying on a cot and 4 or 5 soldiers under it hiding, and my countryman exclaiming to them, "Bring out the chist, or by Jesus, I'll blow ye brains out." It was a medicine chest. He thought it was the army treasury. I told him of his mistake and got him out. We chased the enemy to the lake. They took to water like ducks to swim across, our men firing at their heads. They had gone some 50 yards when someone cried for us to stop firing. We did so. He hailed the Mexicans in Spanish and told them to come back, and we would not hurt them. They returned, and as they neared the shore, he said, "Now, boys, give it to them," which they did, killing some 200. I never fired a shot. Sion Record Bostic, who had joined up with Mosley Baker's command, had this recollection of the events. The next day in the evening, Houston ordered us to attack the Mexicans. Sherman on the left commenced the fight. We were all on foot except a small cavalry force under Lamar. We moved down a slope slowly, but when we started up a long sloping ridge, the Mexican breastworks were on the top of it, we all went in double quick. Every one of us was yelling, "Remember the Alamo, remember Fannin." In a little while, the Mexicans broke and ran. Just back of there was low marshy land and a kind of lake. Many of them tried to cross, but they bogged down, and we shot them. A few got through, and we captured them the next day. Joseph Lawrence shared this memory. As we closed in and began the work of the 2 small cannons, the twin sisters on them, they retreated in disorder toward the bridge. We followed the cavalry. For the first 6 miles, they ran very even and kept out of reach, but after that we gained on them and shot our carbines at them, dropping them off their horses. We then used our holster pistols and long knives. There was not one of our 80 men that did not get one or more of the Mexicans. At the end of 12 miles, we all stopped to rest, and let our horses rest. When we dismounted, we were so fatigued we could not stand up and fell around like a company of drunken men. M. H. Denham shared this memory of the battle. On the morning of the 21st, they were reinforced by General Coase with near 600 men, thus making their force nearly double ours. The crisis was now approaching. The battleground was something in the shape of a horseshoe, and if we delayed in attacking them, other reinforcements were on their march to join them, and if they attacked us and we were defeated, there was no possible chance of us to retreat. We had a chance of defeating them, although so much superior to us in everything, they being Santa Anna's choice troops. It was therefore determined to attack them without delay. About 3 o'clock in the evening of the 21st, we formed in 3 columns and advanced to the attack. We moved on rapidly until within 150 yards of their lines over a prairie. They were in the woods. When we deployed into line and charged up to their works, they kept up a very severe fire on us for about 20 minutes, when their whole line gave way, and a scene of slaughter took place which defied description. We knew what would be our fate if we were defeated, for Santa Anna had sworn to save no lives, and our men in retaliation had sworn the same. They were pursued until dark, and that alone put an end to the carnage. The cry of the Alamo, La Bahia was heard above the roaring of the cannons and the crack of the rifles. The ground was strewed with them for miles. Their famous lancers were pursued 5 miles and entirely cut to pieces. Of about 100 who attempted to cross the river, all but 9 were killed or drowned. Their whole army was annihilated. Out of the 1,200, but 9 escaped. Near 600 were killed on the field, and the rest wounded and taken prisoners. Another contemporary account written days after the event stated, "Never did men engage in battle with a firmer determination to conquer or die. They had nothing to hope of mercy from the perfidious and cruel enemy. They had no hope of life but in victory." George Erath, who I've mentioned a couple of times, remembered the battle as follows. Descending into a sink of ground, then reaching a small eminence 200 or 300 yards from the Mexicans, we were ordered to wheel by left into front, which was done, and brought us to the top of the hill. Coming from the front, General Houston came dashing through our lines. The Mexican bullets were flying. The 2nd Regiment on our left had already joined combat. General Houston cried, "Not a man reinforcement, not a man reinforcement," and galloping on was wounded soon after. I have said we knew of the reinforcement. I knew it, and the whole of the company to which I belonged knew it well. By going up the hill to the thicket where the council mentioned took place, we could almost count the Mexicans. They could also be seen by climbing trees. At about 11 o'clock that morning, a man stationed in a tree was telling those below what he saw, when a load of grape shot went through the treetops and he slipped down in a hurry. I had heard a confidential conversation between General Rusk and Colonel Burleson in which Rusk said the idea must be put out that Santa Anna had gone, and that the men coming into the camp at daylight were the escort returning which had guarded him out. The disposition we were in at that time to fight and in the suspense was not affected by that cry of "not a man reinforcement." The idea flashed to me at the moment that under the fire of their Mexican artillery and in the excitement of the opening battle, it was an insult to us to think we could care for that little reinforcement. We would have fought the whole world then. We had been marched from the Guadalupe in a roundabout, zigzag way through swamps and bogs. We had lived part of the time on half-spoiled beef. We had been delayed in going through the lower country, often standing knee-deep in water, waiting on baggage wagons to be drawn out of bogs. We had the experience of having even a woman draw a gun on us, some of us, for confiscating her oxen under orders, and we had been subjected to all the military discipline and practices that were ever enforced on troops of any country, standing guard 24 hours out of 48, and not allowed to go to sleep even at the guard fire. General Houston made us a speech at Harrisburg as we started on our march to attack the Mexicans. He promised us that we should have full satisfaction for all we had gone through, and he closed his address by saying, "Let your war cry be, remember the Alamo." And Erath continued, "As the Mexicans shot high, nearly all the harm done to us was done during the descent of the hill to the Mexican line. We reserved our fire. It seemed to me that the order to fire as premature, as we were 150 yards, I thought, from the Mexicans. While reloading my gun after my first fire, I choked the ball. A young man named Ed Blakely was mortally wounded higher up the hill. He ran along by my side until he fell. I picked up his gun and shot bag and threw mine down. The whole Mexican line was in full flight by the time I got a second shot. Our men advanced rather in disorder and drove the Mexicans across the boggy slough where many fell. Their cannon had been taken and passed. Ours had ceased firing because we were too closely mixed with the Mexicans. At a point of timber across the slough, which was by this time bridged with bogged horses on which we crossed, a Mexican officer of high rank, flourishing his sword, made a grand appeal to rally his men, but was shot down. And the men who had turned to face us again resumed their flight, only to be overtaken and shot. I do not like to dwell on these scenes. No doubt our men were justifiable, as the Mexican nation deserved punishment for its perfidy, though the soldiers were not responsible for it. About half of them were killed, some drowned in the bay. General Almonte, with commendable daring, came forward among our men, called for officers, and demanded to be allowed to surrender. About 500 men grouped up behind him on the principle of civilized warfare. I did not see this. I believe Colonel Burleson was the officer who accepted the surrender and gave the orders to cease firing. At the time, I was with a large party of men, all from different commands, who were pursuing Mexicans toward the bay. Some attempted to swim across. I returned then. Our troops were scattered and as much in disorder as the Mexicans. It took me some time to find the regiment or the nucleus with the colonel in it, about the center of the Mexicans. The drums were beating the assembly, and men were slowly coming in. And Rusk summarized the battle with the following words. And this was from his report to Burnett. Early next morning, about 9 o'clock, the enemy received a reinforcement of 500 men under the command of General Martin Perfect de Cos, which increased their strength to 1,400 or 1,500 men. It was supposed that an attack upon our encampment would now be made, and having a good position, we stationed our artillery and disposed of the forces so as to receive the enemy to the best advantage. At 3 o'clock, however, the foe, instead of showing signs of attack, was evidently engaged in fortifying. We determined, therefore, immediately to assail him, and in half an hour we were formed in 4 divisions. The first intended as our right wing, composed of the regulars under Colonel Millard, and the second division under command of Colonel Sidney Sherman formed our left wing. A division commanded by Colonel Burleson formed our center. Our 2 6-pounders under command of Colonel Hockley, Captain Isaac N. Moreland, and Stillwell were drawn upon the right of the center division. The cavalry, under command of Colonel Mirabal B. Lamar, were formed up on the right. At the command to move forward, all the divisions advanced in good order and high spirits. Upon arriving within reach of the enemy, a heavy fire was opened, first with their artillery on our cavalry. A general conflict now ensued. Orders were given to charge. Colonel Sherman's division moved up and drove the enemy from the timber woods occupied by them on their right wing at the same moment that Colonel Burleson's division, together with the regulars, charged upon and mounted upon the breastwork of the enemy and drove them from their cannon. Our artillery, the meanwhile, charging up and firing upon theirs with great effect. The cavalry under Colonel Lamar fell on them at the same time with great fury and great slaughter. Major General Houston acted with great gallantry, encouraging his men to attack and heroically charge in front of the infantry within a few yards of the enemy, receiving at the same time a wound in his leg. The enemy soon took flight, officers and all, some on foot and some on horseback. In 10 minutes after the firing of the first guns, we were charging through the camps and driving them before us. They who fled in confusion and dismay down the river followed closely by our troops for 4 miles. Some of them took the prairie, and more pursued by our cavalry. Others were shot in attempting to swim the river, and in a short period the sanguinary conflict was terminated by the surrender of nearly all who were not slain in the combat. One half of their army perished, the other half are prisoners. Another early account said the enemy fired their cannons 5 times only. It was loaded the 6th time and primed. The man who held the match was killed by a boy and the piece taken. It is a splendid brass 9-pounder bearing the inscriptions El Volcan and Violati Fulmina Regis in Roman capital letters. The cannon was taken and the enemy put to rout. Of the whole right wing of the enemy, 1 man only escaped death. They were slaughtered and finally driven into the water, and the rifles ceased not their crack, while an object appeared above the surface of it. The left wing of the enemy fled in confused order, commanded by Colonel Almonte, and laid down their arms and surrendered to a small body of cavalry 2 miles from the battlefield. And this was the surrender that was talked about before. And some say that Seguin and his Tejano soldiers were involved in the surrender of Almonte. James Washington Winters recollected the following. After dinner, the men were ready for battle. I was in Sherman's division, left wing of attack, but under my own captain, William Ware. Rush started out with us, but turned and went to the artillery. When we ran over the ridge, we lost sight of the rest. On beginning the battle, before we got inside of the Mexicans, they began firing at us. They were lying down in the grass. We examined the place where many had been and found as many as 5 ends of cartridges where each man lay. So suppose that each man had fired at us as many as 5 times before we reached them. Their breastworks were composed of baggage, saddlebags, and brush, in all about 4 or 5 feet high. There was a gap 8 or 10 feet wide through which they fired the cannon. I saw Houston in the midst of the enemy's tents near the 1st Regiment to the right. A Mexican officer tried to rally his men, but was soon dispatched by a rifle ball and fell from his horse. Our regiment passed beyond the Mexicans' breastwork before we knew it, while our other 2 regiments came up in front of them. So then we did them up in short order. I never heard any halt ordered. We never halted. The battle was won in 15 or 18 minutes. The Mexican cavalry broke in disorder while ours was hotly pursuing them. Houston had 2 horses killed from under him and was on his 3rd one before he passed the Mexican works. We ran and fought fully 2 miles. The day after the battle, James Tarleton wrote this very fresh account to his brothers. At last, at 3:30 p.m., we were ordered to prepare for battle, which was soon done, and then commenced a conflict, the parallel of which, I presume, cannot be found on record. To see a mere handful of raw, undisciplined volunteers just taken from their plows and thrown together with rifles without bayonets, no 2 perhaps of the same caliber, and circled only by 2 pieces of artillery, 6-pounders, and a few musketeers, some with and some without bayonets, and some 40 or 50 men on horseback to meet the trained bands of the hero of so many victories, to see them with trailed arms marching to within some 60 or 70 yards of such an army, at least doubled in number, entrenched 2 behind a breastwork impregnable to small arms, and protected by a long brass 9-pounder, to see them, I say, do all this, fearless and determined to save their country and their country's liberty, or to die in the effort, was no ordinary occurrence. Yet such was their conduct, and so irresistible was that Spartan phalanx, that it was not more than from 15 to 20 minutes from our first fire until a complete rout of the enemy was effected. And such slaughter on the one side and such almost miraculous preservation on the other have never been heard of since the invention of gunpowder. The commencement of the attack was accompanied by the watchwords, "Remember the Alamo, Laborde, and Tampico," at the very top of our voices. And in some 10 minutes, we were in the full possession of the enemy's encampment, cannon, all things else. whilst his veterans were in the greatest possible disorder, attempting by flight to save their lives. I happened to be so placed in the regiment to which I was attached that I was enabled to be the third men who entered the entrenchment, which I soon left in company with the balance of the regiment in pursuit of the defeated enemies of the Texian liberty. I feel confident that I do not exaggerate when I state their loss in killed as nearly, if not quite equal to the whole of our number engaged, whilst we had only 6 killed on the spot and some 12 or 15 wounded, 2 of whom have died since. One of them, Dr. Motley of Kentucky, a relative of Mr. Shapley Owen, who died tonight, and since I commenced writing this letter. The number of our prisoners has not yet been officially announced, but I should suppose it to be nearly, if not quite 600, many of whom are wounded. So complete has been our triumph and their defeat that my antipathy to them has subsided, and I can now commiserate their condition. Now, there's an anonymous account by a Mexican officer that's in existence, and it reads, "Seeing that the president had no alternative, we began to beat our retreat with a few cavalry, having been chased by the enemy more than 4 leagues until we reached a creek 12 varas wide and very deep. There had been a wooden bridge at that passage, but the enemy had ordered that it be set afire that morning after General Cosa's division had crossed it. We had not received news of the destruction of the mentioned bridge. When we reached it, we had no recourse but to jump into the water with our horses, as we had no time with the enemy upon us. Santa Anna was undecided about what he would do, but I and Senor Cos jumped into the water. It was impossible, however, for the horses to climb the opposite side because of a large thick wall that was there. We abandoned them to go out on foot, but since there were enemies on the opposite bank, most that crossed were killed or captured. I had the good luck to escape through the brush. I walked 4 days on foot through very thick brushwood by nights, as I could not take the road. Needing to cross the Brazos River myself, and another soldier that accompanied me accomplished this by constructing a poor wooden raft that we strapped together with our sashes. We managed to arrive on the 25th at the camp of Filisola, who prohibited me from writing to W the details of this disgrace. Other things happened that I must not trust to the pen. I arrived at this port of Matamoros, where I am writing now. I have recuperated and feel better." And this is thought to have been from a letter written home, and it was found as part of a pamphlet called The Imprint of the Testimony of Valdez. And it's in the University of Texas Archives and shared by the Sons of DeWitt Colony .org. And another interesting compilation, and this is not from the official report. This is from Henry Foote's Texas and Texans Volume 2 that was published in 1841, and it recounts some of the memories of General Thomas Rusk. And according to Rusk, when the 1st Regiment and the regulars had advanced within about 100 yards of the breastwork of the enemy, a charge was made by a division of the Mexicans under the command of Colonel Cespedes, I think, on our artillery, which was at this time a little in advance. Mexican cannon, which had been previously directed toward our cavalry, was now ordered to make way for the charging party upon our artillery, and was pointed in the direction of the 1st Regiment. An attempt was made to fire it, but the man who held the match was shot down by our soldiers. The 1st Regiment, at that instant, with the most deafening yell I ever heard, charged upon the breastwork. Our cannon fired at the same moment, and the Mexicans at the breastwork and cannon, as well as their charging party, commenced an immediate and disorderly flight. General Castrillon, who was commanding the Mexican artillery, was standing on the ammunition boxes behind the piece, exposed from head to foot. He used every effort to keep his men to the gun. When he found that to be impossible, he folded up his arms, stood and looked sullenly, and without moving, upon our troops, who were advancing upon him, until they arrived at or near the breastwork. He was 50 yards in the rear of his retreating men when he turned round deliberately and walked slowly off. He had proceeded some 30 or 40 steps when he was shot and fell. I examined him after the battle and found that several rifle balls had passed directly through his body. Castrillon was a Gauchapin, or European Spaniard, was said to be quite a gentlemanly, honorable man, and was a general of artillery. And Rusk also said that at the close of the fight, and just after sundown, Colonel Almonte came out of the woods and surrendered with about 250 men. There were, at that place, not exceeding 10 or 15 Americans, and none of them could speak the Mexican language well. The prisoners were standing in a body, and they were asked in the Spanish language if any of them could speak English. Almonte answered in Spanish that they could not. They were then told in Spanish to form 2 and 2 deep and march with us to camp. They formed and commenced marching accordingly. Our few men were distributed around them as a guard. Most of us were very much fatigued, and such was the condition of the Mexicans also. As we proceeded along in this way, one of our men, who was so much tired that he could scarcely walk, being accommodated by a Mexican who was walking immediately before him and who had dropped out of the line of the prisoners, observed to the intruder in English, "God damn you, if you don't get back in line, I'll with my bayonet." A word is missing there. This conversation occurred near Almonte, who immediately told the prisoner who had been thus addressed what had been said to him. I concluded that he at least must understand English very well, and that it was probably Almonte whom I saw before me. I therefore observed to him, "You must be Colonel Almonte." He replied in English, "You speak very well." I then rode up to him and gave him my hand, saying to him, "It affords me great pleasure to see you, Colonel." With great presence of mind and with his customary politeness, he responded, "The pleasure is reciprocal." During the fight, a Mexican officer found himself at the very muzzle of a rifle in the hands of one of our men. He begged for mercy and happened at that moment to see a Mexican who was in our ranks, whose name was Menchaca, whom he had known for many years at Bear. He bellowed out to Menchaca, calling him a brother Mexican, and invoked him to save his life. Menchaca replied, "No, damn you, I'm no Mexican, I'm an American, shoot him." And the soldier fired and killed him. Whilst the battle was in progress, the celebrated Deaf Smith, although on horseback, was with the infantry. When they got pretty near the enemy, Smith galloped on ahead and dashed directly up to the Mexican line. Just as he reached it, his horse stumbled and fell, throwing him over his head and among the enemy. Having dropped his sword in the fall, he jumped up, drew one of his belt pistols, presented it at the head of a Mexican who was attempting to bayonet him, and the percussion cap exploded without the pistol going off, upon which Smith threw the pistol at the head of the Mexican, staggered him back, seized his gun, took it from him, and defended him with it until the infantry got up to his relief. And continuing on, this account says, a young man by the name of Robbins during the fight dropped his gun, happening to run directly in contact with a Mexican soldier who had also lost his gun. The Mexican seized Robbins, and both being stout men soon fell to the ground. Robbins managed, whilst contending on the earth, to get out a bowie knife, which he had in his belt, and quickly ended the contest by cutting the Mexican's throat. About the commencement of the battle, Dr. Motley, a gentleman from Kentucky, and myself were proximate to each other, near a corner of the enemy's breastwork. I saw Motley fall and asked him if he was hurt. He replied, "Yes, I believe I am mortally wounded." I observed, "Doctor, I will get someone to take care of you." He responded, "No. If you whip them, send back a man to assist me. But if you do not, I shall need no assistance." He died the next day, perfectly resigned to his fate. And now there's another interesting story that shows some of the anger that some of the soldiers did have. And it says, on starting out from our camp to enter upon the attack, I saw an old gentleman by the name of Curtis carrying 2 guns. I asked him what was his reason for carrying more than 1 gun. He answered, "Damn the Mexicans, they killed my son-in-law in the Alamo, and I intend to kill 2 of them for it, or be killed myself." I saw the old man again during the fight, and he told me he had killed his 2 men, and if he could find Santa Anna, he would cut a razor strop out of his back. When the Mexicans were first driven from the point of woods where we encountered them, their officers tried to rally them, but the men cried, It's no use. It's no use. There are 1,000 Americans in the woods. When Santa Anna saw Almonte's division running past him, he called to a drummer and ordered him to beat his drum. The drummer held up his hands and told him he was shot. He called out then to a trumpeter near him to sound his horn. The trumpeter replied that he also was shot. Just at that instant, a ball from one of our cannon struck a man who was standing near Santa Anna, taking off one side of his head. Santa Anna then exclaimed, "Damn these Americans, I believe they will shoot us all." These particulars I received from a little boy who was one of our prisoners and said he was standing near Santa Anna at the time. He immediately mounted his horse and commenced his flight. And Houston's summary is as follows. At 3:30 in the evening, I ordered the officers of the Texian army to parade their respective commands, having in the meantime ordered the bridge on the only road communicating with the Brazos, distant 8 miles from our encampment, to be destroyed, thus cutting off all possibility of escape. Our troops paraded with alacrity and spirit and were anxious for the contest. Their conscious disparity in numbers only seemed to increase their confidence and heighten their anxiety for the conflict. Our situation afforded us an opportunity of making the arrangements preparatory to the attack without exposing our designs to the enemy. And then he goes through the order of battle. 1st Regiment with Burleson side to the center. 2nd Regiment under the command Colonel Sherman formed the left wing of the army. The artillery under the special command of George W. Hockley, who was Inspector General, was placed on the right of the 1st Regiment, and 4 companies of infantry under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Millard sustained the artillery upon the right. Our cavalry, 61 in number, commanded by Colonel Mirabeau B. Lamar, whose gallant and daring conduct on the previous day had attracted the admiration of his comrades and called him to that station, placed on our extreme right, completed our line. Our cavalry was first dispatched to the front of the enemy's left for the purpose of attracting their notice, whilst our extensive island of timber afforded us an opportunity of concentrating our forces and displaying from that point agreeable to the previous design of the troops. Every evolution was performed with alacrity, the whole advancing rapidly in line and through an open prairie without any protection whatever for our men. The artillery advanced and took station within 200 yards of the enemy's breastwork and commenced an effective fire with grape and canister. Colonel Sherman, with his regiment, having commenced the action upon our left wing, the whole line at the center and on the right, advancing in double quick time, sung the war cry, "Remember the Alamo," received the enemy's fire, and advanced within point-blank shot before a piece was discharged from our lines. Our line advanced without a halt until they were in possession of the woodland and the enemy's breastwork. The right wing of Burleson's and the left of Millard's taking possession of the breastwork, our artillery having gallantly charged up within 70 yards of the enemy's cannon, where it was taken by our troops. The conflict lasted about 18 minutes from the time of close action until we were in possession of the enemy's encampment, taking one piece of cannon loaded, 4 stand-of colors, all their camp equipage, stores, and baggage. Our cavalry had charged and routed that of the enemy upon the right and given pursuit to the fugitives, which did not cease until they arrived at the bridge, which I have mentioned before. Captain Carnes, always among the foremost in danger, commanding the pursuers. The conflict in the breastwork lasted but a few moments. Many of the troops encountered hand-to-hand, and not having the advantage of bayonets on our side, our riflemen used their pieces as war clubs, breaking many of them off at the breach. The rout commenced at 4:30, and the pursuit of the main army continued until twilight. A guard was then left in charge of the enemy's encampment, and our army returned with our killed and wounded. And James Washington Winters, to go back to him, he shared this following recollection of the aftermath. He said, "After the fight was ended, Houston gave orders to form in line and march back to camp, but we paid no attention to him as we were all shaking hands and rejoicing over the victory. Houston gave the orders 3 times, and still the men paid no attention to him. And he turned his horse around and said, 'Men, I can gain victories with you, but damn your manners,' and rode on to camp." Joel Robinson and Sylvester brought in Santa Anna. I was there when he was brought in, was digging the grave to bury our 8 men. They passed by us and halted at our guard lines. The Mexicans' prisoners clapped their hands and gave other signs of joy, shouting, "Santa Anna, Santa Anna." I dropped my tools and followed after them to Houston, who was lying on his cot at the camp near the bayou. Santa Anna introduced himself and they began to talk. I do not know who captured Cos, but he was the most frightened man I ever saw. He covered his head with a blanket. I could see it tremble 20 feet off. The greatest slaughter in the battle occurred between the breastworks and the lake. Here the Mexicans and horses killed made a bridge across the bayou. And Washington continued and said, General Wharton tried to get us to cease and grabbed a Mexican and pulled him up behind him on his horse, saying that was his Mexican. But Jim Curtis shot the Mexican. The Mexican infantry near the lake would jump in occasionally and would dive to get away from our shots, but the minute they would raise their heads, they were picked off by our men. Only a few followed the flying Mexicans to Vince's Bayou. The Mexicans, finding the bridge burned, tried to cross, but their horses bogged. Only one of those trying to cross there got away. All the others were shot. When Santa Anna was brought into camp, some called out, "Shoot him, hang him." General Houston ordered the men who made these threats taken away. Next day after the battle, finding that many Mexicans were hidden in the marsh grass, someone set fire to the grass and burned or smoked them out. In this way, about 40 were captured. One who tried to run was shot. The same day, I found a dead Mexican who had silver in his belt, about $10. The money had slipped out when he was shot. Orders were given that all money found be brought into headquarters. I turned this in. Money so captured was distributed to the soldiers, the amount so distributed averaging almost $11 per man. Santa Anna's handsomely ornamented saddle was held up, and the men voted that it should be given to General Houston. Other officers' saddles were sold. One brought as high as $300. I certify that the above statement is correct, or as nearly correct as I can remember. And as I mentioned earlier, Stephen F. Austin's nephew was present, but Stephen F. Austin, of course, was not. And the nephew reported that at one part of the slaughter, an officer ordered some men to stop their butchery. They did not, and he was stood down by a cocked rifle that was reserved for him and his order. They just weren't going to listen to the orders to stop and just take prisoners. Another account, in June 1836, John W. Hassell wrote this letter to his father describing the battle. He said, "We then marched up with 763 men and forced the line of battle within 200 yards of the enemy, when they stood in good order to receive us. We then marched up within good rifle shot, our men and officers pleasant, cool, and brave as lions. Firing then commenced on both sides. Our colonel then ordered Yankee Doodle played," and there's another song said to be played at the battle, "and beat in double quick time, and we were commanded to a charge, and it appeared to me that we were among them in an instant, and it would have done your heart good to have seen them fall. Our cannons, our muskets, our rifles, and pistols played, it appeared to me, the most delightful tune I have ever heard since the world commenced. I had a first-rate rifle, and about this time I was using her, sir, with all my might. She run about 40 to the pound and shot first-rate. I took notice to some of the big yellow bellies, and when Betsy would bore a hole in them, the claret would gush out large as cornstalks. One big fellow, I remember, who I shot in the neck, and it appeared that it had near cut his head off. I shot old Betsy 6 times and a large holster pistol 1 time, and the 7 shots I know that I killed 4. That thing I know. As I've stated about my pistol, I shot that fellow in the left eyes. Though it may appear strange to you, but not less stranger than true, it seemed to do me more good at that time to throw shot or a bayonet run through them than anything I have ever yet seen, and it appeared to be the prevailing feeling or sentiment. Well, sir, I must tell you that when we got so near with them as to shake hands, they couldn't bear that. They appeared rather bashful at such a meeting as that, and turned their backs to us, and the rest of the way off about that time we were slaying them like cornstalks. This was an open field fight. We gained complete victory over them in about 16 minutes. We took about 700 prisoners, a large number of which was wounded, a great number of which proved mortal. We took all the officers except two. One lieutenant colonel, one captain made their escape. The monster, Santa Anna, who can have men taken out and murdered without a change of countenance or the least remorse of conscience. After making a solemn and sacred treaty, such conduct could not be expected from savage heathen, much less from a nation who pretended to be enlightened, civilized, and Christianized. That was one of the most brutal depictions that I came across. Another is by Isaac Lafayette Hill, who shared an interesting exchange after the battle between Houston and his nemesis, I guess, Mosley Baker. And Hill recorded, on the afternoon of the 21st, when the army was paraded to attack the Mexicans, Captain Baker harangued his company. He said he wished his men neither to ask or give quarter, as a token of which he proposed that the company carry a red flag. A vote was taken whether we should or should not, but one man, John H. Money, voted against it. A red handkerchief was therefore hoisted for a flag and carried until the battle commenced, when from cause it was thrown away. When the army started back to camp after the battle, it was about dusk. It was halted a moment at the breastworks of the Mexicans, and General Houston addressed it in a few very eloquent sentences, which I long remembered but have now forgotten. After he had concluded, he said to Captain Baker, "Captain B, have I not done my duty?" "Yes, General," replied our captain, "but I wish you had done it sooner." I was not aware that General Houston had been wounded until about the time he began to address the army. Houston's official report stated that the engagement resulted in the deaths of 630 Mexican soldiers. Another 208 were wounded, and 730 total were taken prisoner. The Texan army suffered the casualties of 9 dead and 34 wounded, including Houston. 2 men fell during the battle. They, along with 6 others that later died of injuries, were buried where they had camped. Another man lived long enough to be transported to Galveston. I mentioned him, and he was wounded in a skirmish on the 20th, where he finally succumbed to the injuries sustained in combat.
The great visionary leader of India, Mahatma Gandhi, said, "It is health that is real wealth, and not pieces of gold and silver." Listen to the Healthy Grocer radio show on your favorite podcast platform. We know that health is our greatest wealth, and we will be discussing all aspects of natural healing. Explore everything from supplements, superfoods, and healthy lifestyle choices to help conquer stress and boost productivity. Top industry experts and natural health professionals join us for a deep dive into our healing journey. You can find the Healthy Grocer radio show on demand every day, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And remember, health is your greatest wealth.
You are listening to Texas History Lessons, a slow walk through Texas history made in Texas by a Texan for everyone, everywhere.
And for those listening to the Battle of San Jacinto broken up into sections, this is the end of this section. There's a whole lot more to come. A lot more. I wanted this episode to be mostly focused on personal accounts, and I think taken all together, you get a pretty good sense of the actual events of the conflict of the battle itself. There's still a lot to look into. There's some more comments about after the battle to look into. There's some investigation into how did Peggy McCormick react to having her cattle field turned into a site of the battle, and a lot more coming. Thank you for listening. This was a long episode, but I didn't want to break it up any shorter. I thought it was important to keep everything together. It was a hard one. It's a lot of violence. I apologize for some of the language that was said and some of the depictions of violence, but that is what war is. And to do otherwise would be to disrespect the dead and the people that fought. And that's not, I believe, the right course of action, not to clean it up too much. It needs to be shared as to how it really was and how better to hear it than from the men that were involved. So yeah, join us next time as we continue our look at the Battle of San Jacinto. And thanks for listening. The music is provided by the great Derek McClendon. Thanks to him. And take care of yourself. Take care of one another. Be kind. Adios.